We're all in on the draft with Kevin Pelton, ESPN's NBA insider. His draft grades are up, and that includes some of the trades that happened last night. Kevin is based in the Washington area, so he probably has seen Matisse Thybulle up close and personal a bunch of times. He also has some insight on why the Sixers were making so many trades last night. What's the story there? And he is kind enough to join us right now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline. As Kevin, in years past, Sam Hinkie used to stockpile second-round picks, and then people complained. All you do was got all these second-round picks. Now they traded all these second-round picks, and you know what people are doing? They're complaining that they didn't take any guys in the second round. So just sight unseen, what was your take on Elton Brand's plan last night? What do you see that Elton Brand was trying to accomplish?
Well, people are always going to complain about something, right? That's
the nature
of this thing. Yeah. I was a little surprised by it because I thought that one thing they would really try to accomplish with those second-round picks is the fact that, if you draft a player in the second round and sign him for the minimum or even less than the 2-year veteran minimum, they counted that amount for the luxury tax as opposed to even if you sign an undrafted rookie for the minimum, they counted the 2-year veterans minimum to try to encourage teams to pursue veterans instead of just signing younger players to fill out their bench. So, that's why I thought they would have really been quite valuable to them, given the fact that the Sixers have a chance to be in the tax this year if they re-sign all of Jimmy Butler and Tobias Harris and J.J. Redick, and I guess perhaps even in the scenario where they don't sign all three of those guys. So I was a little surprised by it, but the tax also obviously directly influenced one of those moves, giving the 42 pick to Washington, along with Jonathan Simmons to clear that $1 million guaranteed portion of his contract off the books.
Let's since you just brought that up, let's bring that up here, because he said, Elton said, we need every dollar that we can get. $1 million. It seems like, how is $1 million beneficial to them? But if you're looking at the 76ers and see that $1 million, is there a advantage of clearing that $1 million bucks off that you can see that maybe can read some tea leaves and connect some dots on?
Well, it's a tax situation because if you do end up going into the tax, you're not paying just $1 million for it. You're paying $1 million plus the, 1.5 times that in terms of luxury taxes if you're just barely into the luxury tax. If they had stretched it over 3 years and then had a third of that $333,000 on the books each year, then future years after Ben Simmons' extension kicks in, you could be talking many multiples of that in terms of luxury tax. So not surprising that they would try to move on from it. I think the price was maybe a little bit higher than it would have been otherwise because of the fact that they had to complete this move before the start of free agency on July 1st when that amount guarantees for Jonathan Simmons. So they couldn't wait for a team to clear cap space at the start of the new league year, like a lot of the trades that we've seen agreed to in the last couple of weeks here that aren't going to actually get executed until July 6th after the moratorium. The Sixers couldn't wait for that. They needed a team with a trade exception willing to do it right away.
ESPN's Kevin Pelton with us. So the Sixers had 24. They moved up to 20. Matisse Thybulle, they gave up 33 to get there. How do you grade or look at that, what they gave up to move to that spot for Elton Brand?
Well, from a value proposition, it's pretty reasonable. I put together several years ago a trade value chart for draft picks, much like in the NFL, although it's like the model that statistical analysts have created that bases it on the historical outcomes from those picks rather than the Jimmy Johnson trade chart that the teams generally use that, kind of tends to overvalue higher picks. It was a little bit of an overpay by that trade value chart, but not a big one when you consider that teams often pay a huge premium to move up, including when we saw Atlanta make that trade from 8 to 4 last night with New Orleans. That was a good example of that. I guess the question is kind of the process there in terms of, my first reaction when I saw that trade was they were trying to jump ahead of Oklahoma City, who is another team that had been linked to Matisse Thybulle, picky at 21. Now it seems like some of the subsequent reporting suggests that it might have been a case where Boston was just threatening to take him and, much like the Sixers did with Elfrid Payton under Sam Hinkie and got Dario Saric and the return of their first-round pick out of that deal, a really nice deal for them, demanding some compensation from the Sixers in order to make sure that they got their guy.
So what do you know about Thybulle? And obviously he seemingly is a guy who is very good defensively, has a little bit or a ways to go maybe offensively. I'm sure you have seen a lot more of them than the average listener out there.
I've seen a lot more of him than most people in the world, having watched him for 4 years at the University of Washington. Probably about half of those games in person at home over the last 4 years, or more than that even. He's a phenomenal defender, and I've never seen someone I've enjoyed watching play defense as much as Matisse Thybulle in the 2-3 zone that Mike Hopkins brought with him from Syracuse. He was just usually you think of the defense as being reactive, and he was very much the opposite. He was dictating what the offense was doing with his length, his anticipation, his ability to, cover a large amount of ground and block shots from behind, come up with steals. It's going to be a little bit different for him, certainly, in a man-to-man scheme in the NBA, but, his physical tools are well suited for that in terms of the long wingspan. He played a lot more man-to-man his first 2 years under Lorenzo Romar before Hopkins came in, and was certainly very capable there. I mean, I've thought for a long time that he was going to be an NBA player, dating back to his freshman year when he was someone who was, kind of the third most touted prospect on that team among the freshmen behind DeJounte Murray and Marquise Chris, both of whom were drafted in the first round after their freshman year. But, I think the question obviously is going to be how much he continues to grow offensively. He's not a natural ball handler, someone who's really comfortable with the ball in his hands a lot of the time, although he does have good court vision as a passer. And shooting-wise, the form looks good. He's been strong at the free throw line. The threes just haven't necessarily gone in as consistently as frequently as you would expect based on that. So, I think that's going to be the challenge for the Sixers coaching staff, is can you do work with him to hone that stroke and get to the point where, if he can be a 35, 36% three-point shooter in the NBA as he was in college, he's going to be a very valuable role player.
Yeah, I mean, he shot 40% from three his sophomore year, but that's kind of dipped off a little bit here. And obviously they're going to have to work with him on offense. But you mentioned he played zone, and now he's going to be primarily a man-to-man guy. And in the zone, he seemed to really excel there. But he has the tools, you feel, that he can come in. And can he be a guy who's, out on the wing defending multiple guys, which is, everything's about switching in the NBA now?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting is we saw last year after the Robert Covington trade that the Sixers had a tougher time defending point guards because, those guys are often much smaller than Ben Simmons. It's not really the forte of Jimmy Butler, as great as he is defensively. And I think Thybulle could slot into that role where he uses his wingspan, much like Covington, to kind of swallow up the vision of point guards and is quick enough laterally to stay with them. So I would kind of expect that to be his initial role defensively, and then someone who is comfortable. And he's not going to be a great defender in the post if that's what you're asking him to do, but with his size, if you're switching a 1-4 pick and roll and he's defending the point guard, you feel okay with him defending the power forward. It's certainly not like if you have, some 6'2" point guard switched on to a big man.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it seems like he needs to get more comfortable on the offensive side. It just seems like he just doesn't know what his role is or doesn't know what his strengths and weaknesses are. Like he's really trying to find himself offensively.
Well, I mean, I think I would say that he kind of knew his role maybe a little bit too much in terms of people always wanted more scoring from him here in Seattle, and that just wasn't his comfort level, and particularly with the ball in his hands. But I think if you're operating, it's a situation where I think what the Sixers are going to want him to do is, number one, be a threat, is a catch and shoot option on the weak side, and then number two, if teams do start closing out hard to him, to be able to put the ball on the ground a couple of times, find an open teammate. And like I said, he did show good court vision, good entry passing from the wing. It's really that more operating off the dribble, I think, is going to be an area of improvement for him.
Now, is he a guy that you think can jump in and play, be in a rotation from day one?
I think so. I mean, he was the best defensive player in the country last year, the Naismith Defensive Player of the Year. One of the better players overall in the country if you kind of look at it from an advanced stats perspective. He's got 4 years of experience at the college level. I mean, it's always a transition for everyone at the NBA level, but I think he's relatively prepared to contribute. Kevin
Pelton is with us, and you can check out all of his draft grades at ESPN.com. And, Kevin, the Sixers, they basically traded everything away. Is that a sign that maybe Elton Brand, he said today, like, hey, the teams that are in the finals, they don't have a bunch of second-round young players sitting on their bench. Is that a sign that they intend, or he intends, to go out and get a veteran group of guys for that bench? I mean, is that something that he might already have in mind of, all right, I'm not drafting a bunch of young kids tonight because I need to go out and get some veteran players for my bench?
Yeah, I think that would make sense, especially when you look at kind of the trajectory of Elton Brand's own career, where he played that role for, the Atlanta and then to a lesser extent Philly, where he wasn't on the court as much, but more in a leadership role at the end of his career. So, he may be looking for players like that as well. And, I trying to shop at the minimum level with the promise of the fact that not only do you have a chance to potentially play quite a bit because of the fact that there isn't established depth on this Philadelphia team, but also you've got a chance to contend.
The one thing that I would say is there's a lot of people that are like kind of upset. You mentioned the Boston thing, that maybe Boston had some intel and the Sixers kind of jumped over them so that they wouldn't do anything there. And then they gave up pick number 33 to do that. And then they ended up with Jerome. And I would say, like, there was a lot of players, it seemed, in the late first round, early second round that were upperclassmen that the average basketball fan had heard of, which is different from the past, it seems like. There's a lot of draft and stash, and it didn't seem as much going on. There were some seniors and juniors that were at the back end of the draft, like Jerome and Carson Edwards were players that fans hoped that the Sixers would get. Are there guys at the back end and in the second round that you thought, hey, instead of moving out, that you should have just kept or taken somebody like that?
Well, I mean, Thybulle probably belongs in that same group as well. But yeah, if you're looking in the second round, I mean, I think there was pretty good value there in a few players, but the expectations. I think sometimes we think more of the guys who come in and contribute immediately, the Malcolm Brogdons. I'm not sure who this year's example would be, but for the most part, it still takes a while, even if you're a successful college player, to translate to the NBA level. I think Carson Edwards is an interesting example of that, where he's someone who played with the ball in his hands constantly. In college, the offense was built around him, and now he's going to have to adjust to a little bit different role, and that may take some time, even though he's an experienced, effective college player.
Yeah, you look at a guy like Ty Jerome, who had been kind of in the college basketball lexicon for the last couple of years. I know a lot of Sixer fans were hopeful for him. Cam Johnson was a guy that Sixers fans really liked. He went up at 11th at that spot. Bruno Fernando, they actually took and traded. I thought he might have been a nice piece behind a guy like Joel Embiid. So that it seemed like they had guys that fit what they needed, and then for whatever reason just decided it wasn't prudent to keep them. That's where I think a lot of people were kind of like, man, you took guys that seemed like they fit and then traded them out. That's why everybody's kind of trying to find the reason why to that, and it seems like that's the great unknown right now.
Well, the Jerome part of it, like I said, you got to give up something to get something, and that was part of the trade.
Would you have rather had Jerome or Thybulle?
Thybulle. I mean, I think they're both pretty similar prospect-wise, but I had Thybulle ranked a little bit higher. I think the other thing that might have happened, you mentioned Cam Johnson going 11th, Jerome going where he did. If some of those players went a little higher than the Sixers expected, and they thought that they might have had a chance at some of those guys with picks 33, 34, and then eventually 42, I mean, maybe that influenced their decision to move those. That often happens where, you don't necessarily know that you're going to trade those going into the draft, but depending on how the board falls, if the guys you like aren't there, that's when you make that decision.
Kevin Pelton is with us. I guess the Cam Johnson thing, that was probably the surprise of the night, right?
It was, for sure. That's what I answered in our ESPN Plus breakdown. And I later saw the Kobe White video where he's reacting with shock to seeing his teammate get drafted that high. And that maybe was the best expressed how stunning it was, that even his own teammate couldn't believe it happened.
Right. That was, the question that was asked. Hey, what do you think of your teammate getting drafted 11? Wow. Really? Wow. That was, we'll have that audio for you later. Kevin Pelton here. So Thybulle is the pick. And actually, the Sixers did add a second-round player that I would imagine the kid from Iowa State who, could shoot a little bit. That's the second round, right? You just kind of grab a guy who could shoot and is athletic and hope that he translates to the league.
I think that's a lot of what we saw this year. The shooting was valued by teams much more than ever. And then the other thing that tends to happen in the back half of the second round, and my colleague Jonathan Gavoni pointed out in the same breakdown of the draft that it seems to be happening earlier than ever, is that it's really about which players are willing to agree to two-way contracts with teams, and those are the guys they're going to draft, as opposed to someone who'd rather kind of take a shot on themselves and will end up making their way into the league as a undrafted free agent. We saw that a couple couple years ago with Fred VanVleet, who was someone I really liked in the draft and was stunned when he went undrafted. And it later came out that, he had some offers from teams to go in the late second round, but he would have had to agree to that two-way contract. He didn't want to do that, ends up signing with the Raptors, making that team. And, a couple years later, here we are with him making, $8-9 million a year and is a hero in the NBA Finals.
Yeah, and by the way, Mariel Shayok is the player that the Sixers got. Another Canadian player. There was, 4 players from Canada, the most of any country other than the United States ever last night. But he's an interesting guy because he was at Virginia, which if I just tell you, hey, this kid played for Virginia, it kind of screams that he must be able to play defense. But then he goes to Iowa State and becomes a 19-point-a-game scorer, career 38% from three-pointer, 87% from the free throw line. So it seems that a guy who played 4 years of college, he could be one of those late second-round picks that maybe can stick around.
Yeah, you got great coaching at both ends of the court, and not necessarily all at the same time.
The fact is, I saw him at Iowa State playing against West Virginia. The guy was like 8 of 9 from the field. He couldn't miss that day, and I was like, man, my God, this guy's. And then here we are. The Sixers take him at 54 last night. So that's what they do. Thybulle, Shayok, Kevin Pelton breaking it down for it. Check out all of his trade grades and draft grades at ESPN.com and follow him on Twitter at KPelton. Kevin Pelton. Thank you, pal.
All right, thanks as always.
All right, and there you go. He got a chance to go see a lot of Thybulle. He said he probably saw half of his games, all the home games at the University of Washington.